Howdy doody, and welcome back to our journey across the United States, folks. Today we're covering Alabama's strangest lore, from tombstones with faces on them to mysterious vanishings to white, furry creatures that roam your forest at night. Your state's lore is uncanny, to say the least. Now, before we get started, I just want to quickly say, if you find yourself having fun here, your subscription, a comment, and a like are always appreciated, and they're an easy way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with that, let's get into Alabama's weird folklore. This story is told by author Ambrose Bierce, and it states that on a morning in July of 1854, a planter named Williamson, sometimes Orion Williamson, who just lived right outside of Selma, was sitting with his wife and his child near his home. About 50 yards ahead of his home, there was a lawn, and then a public roadway, and beyond that, acres of farmland with some slaves at work under the guidance of an overseer. On this morning, Williamson, while sitting with his family, would remark, "Aw, drat, I forgot to tell Andrew, the overseer, about those horses." Apparently, Williamson had just purchased some horses from a neighbor, and he was going to have them delivered later that day, which was an important thing for the overseer to know. Williamson would begin to walk down the gravel path they had in their property, towards the overseer in the fields ahead of him. This man was named Andrew. He'd pass the road, and then right before he entered the farmland, a neighbor named Mr. Wren would pass by with his 13-year-old son, James. Mr. Wren and his son would say hello and pass on by, but then a little bit down the road, Mr. Wren would remember something, actually about those same horses, the horses he'd sold to Mr. Williamson that he was going to have delivered that day, and he was going to have to deliver them late, probably the next day, so he'd turn his carriage around to tell Mr. Williamson. But then, as they turned around, in clear view of everyone, there was a loud boom and a flash of light, and Mr. Williamson would simply vanish. This occurred simultaneously with the horses that were pulling Mr. Wren stumbling for a second. In reaction to this dramatic booming, James, the 13-year-old, would cry out, "Why, Father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" This story I just told is supposedly the account of the disappearance of Mr. Williamson, as mentioned in legal proceedings related to the Williamson estate. In these accounts, Mr. Wren supposedly said, "My son's exclamation caused me to look towards the spot where I had seen the deceased in an instant before, but he was not there, nor was he visible anywhere. I cannot say that at the moment I was greatly startled or realized the gravity of the occurrence, though I thought it singular. My son, however, was greatly astonished and kept repeating the question. The black boy driving the carriage was similarly astonished, and so were many servants of the Williamsons and the wife of Mr. Williamson. The wife in particular apparently came running down the road screaming, 'He is gone! He is gone! Oh God, what an awful thing!' This event was the last anyone saw or heard of Mr. Williamson. In the aftermath, many present, from Williamson's wife to James to the slaves, would testify to the events that transpired, and a search of the whole region around where this occurred yielded essentially nothing. He hadn't fallen in a hole, it seems, and there wasn't any quicksand or anything that would have taken him into the ground unwittingly. A team of geologists even swung by and dug up much of the field, but they found nothing. There was also a weird turn in the story that, when investigating the fields, Williamson's wife and son began to hear Orion Williamson's voice calling out for help. But over time, these cries became quieter and quieter, to the point that eventually they could no longer be heard at all. The following spring, a circle of dead grass would appear on the same spot where Williamson vanished the previous July, which was strange and sort of yellow-colored. According to the story, the courts apparently decided that Williamson was dead, and his estate would be divided out. But this story had attracted a ton of attention, apparently including that of famous writer of the supernatural, often associated with writing fictional horror, Ambrose Bierce, from whom we get this tale. He would interview individuals associated with this case, and actually involve himself in the search, and in his later travels across the country, he would actually keep this story alive, spreading it and linking it back to the Selma, Alabama region. So as for this story's modern role, it's fairly widely acclaimed. It's been mentioned in everything from more modern interpretations of the story involving a Tennessee man named David Lang, which is essentially the same story, just told taking place in Gallatin, Tennessee, to episodes of Ancient Aliens, which claim this event, that Ambrose interpreted as something supernatural, may actually have been an early American alien abduction. But what's for certain is there's not necessarily any explanation for what actually happened to Williamson. All that's known is he vanished. Admittedly, if you go digging around for other records of an Orion Williamson around Selma from the 1800s, you'll have trouble finding any details of note. There are essentially no records of a Mr. Orion Williamson related to property, business, marriage, or death. But despite this, there are many records from the 1880s where, at least supposedly, individuals came forward corroborating the accounts of Ambrose Bierce, who, I should again reiterate, was a fiction writer. In short, we'll never really know if this was a work of fiction or a true mystery, but regardless, I find a disappearance like this interesting and a proper strange and unique bit of lore. To this day, a lot of people in the Selma area think that it really happened and corroborate that it's true. They say their great-grandparents heard of the disappearance of Mr. Williamson. And you know what? If locals are saying it, maybe I'm inclined to believe them. So while this creature, or these creatures, don't necessarily have some catchy name, when I was researching your state's weird lore, I found something weird. Whispers from across the years of large creatures in your state's waters that, while scattered throughout the state, perhaps hint at something large and perhaps dangerous dwelling in your waterways. The first documented sighting of these large creatures in your water, river serpents if you will, was reported by one Buck Sutton in 1820, who saw a 25-foot-long serpent-like creature undulating in the water on the Tennessee River in Alabama. He saw the creature in its swampy, shallow water, a large snake-like creature with fins slithering near the banks. Some sources say this also may have happened at Van's Hole, or perhaps Ball Play Creek, which is unfortunately named, that's slightly further north right over the border into Tennessee. Regardless, every source shares this detail, that he would turn up mysteriously dead just a few days after seeing this creature, which is pretty important, you'll see. A few years later, in 1825, Billy Burns would see this too, and in 1827, Jim Wyndham would see it as well. They would see something similar to whatever was noted in the Buck Sutton encounter. And of course, strangely enough, these witnesses would also die of unrelated causes shortly after the incident. It's worth noting these earlier stories of river serpents aren't documented in any period-specific literature, but are rather preserved through oral history, and in newspaper articles describing later 1877 accounts of river serpents that we'll talk about in a second. Perhaps this leaves room for embellishment, but frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if there were earlier stories about river serpents, given the clear native influences we'll get into in a minute. Now, as I noted, in 1877, another serpent was seen. This time, nobody died following seeing it, though. The witness was one Mr. Marins L. Foster of Etowah County, Alabama, which houses Gadsden. He apparently first thought this creature was a person swimming in the shallow water, but quickly came to realize it was more aptly described as a river monster. This is the writing of the account describing what Mr. Foster saw, as he approached sufficiently near to see it distinctly. To his horror, it proved to be a living monster, or serpent, with head and neck erect, extending out of the water some 3 or 4 feet. Its head resembling a horse's head, large glaring eyes, and a mouth distended, showing a tongue of fiery red. The monster, or serpent, exhibited no signs of fear, but glared directly at him as it passed, and unprepared as he was, he thought discretion the better part of valor, and beat a hasty retreat to the opposite bank, from which he watched it moving along like a man in a boat, showing now and then portions of its back, until it reached a point opposite Thornton's log yard, where it gave a plunge and disappeared from sight. Mr. Foster is an entirely trustworthy and reliable gentleman, well known in his community and intelligent, and his statements may be relied upon. That he saw some monster there is no doubt in his own mind, but the improbability of this story has caused him to be very reticent about any statement he made on the subject. Again, those are not my words, those are the words of writing at the time. Now, as I said, it's worth noting the Muskogee or Creek and the Cherokee people, before being forced out of the southeast, often told tales of seeing river serpents like these, and many started to wonder if these tales told by native tribes were indeed true, and perhaps even explained by what locals were beginning to come across, a phenomenon that was becoming increasingly common, seen in the region. For instance, there was a party of raftsmen 2 miles north of Gadsden that apparently had their raft attacked by the beast. The men aboard would throw sticks at it, which, it was a river monster, so this didn't seem to dissuade it. The creature, they said, had a white belly and some variety of hump on its back. It didn't take long for folks to start connecting these tales to those of river monsters in Alabama in the 1820s either, and you can actually find this story reported on by the Gadsden Times in June of 1877, as I'd been talking about. Now, as for these Native American legends I brought up, the native people around the Tennessee River, specifically the Cherokee people, told stories of a snake, or a large serpent that lived in the rivers of Alabama. And this serpent wouldn't just eat you, it was an omen. Tales literally, verbatim from the oral history of natives, tell of native children seeing this serpent as they played by the river, and they would pass away shortly after as a result. In short, it seems that this theme of seeing the creature and dying from it, the theme that plagued the 1820s encounters, actually goes way further back than those sightings alone. Perhaps this is somehow linked to another Cherokee story that tells of the Tennessee River somehow being linked to a river that runs to the underworld. And get this, some Cherokee people would actually ride this river on the back of large snakes the size of horses. In Cherokee lore, often you'll see a theme that the water, rivers in particular, are seen as some form of intermediary between the world we inhabit, that of light and life, and the world of darkness, the underworld, or evil places. And that is water, rivers really, that link our two worlds. The Creek Indians, too, told stories historically of a horned water serpent, or snake, that they called the tie snake in some instances. This creature lived in the water and had horns like those of a stag, and occasionally it would leave the waters of Alabama and sun itself near its dwelling. They sometimes said this creature was a man transformed into a serpent too. As for other influences that may have spurred these tales, it's worth noting that in the early 1830s, in particular in 1834, the bones of a whale species, Basilosaurus, were found in Clark County, Alabama. At the time, these whale bones were thought to be the bones of a huge, I quote, lizard king, as they put it, and many thought these were the bones of a prehistoric sea monster that may possibly still dwell into modern day. Additionally, this is probably less a factor, but the rivers of Alabama are known to be extremely diverse, with the Coosa Basin in particular having 147 fish species, alligators, and more, meaning, perhaps to many, it was already not exactly a new thought for a creature before unseen to show itself in these rivers. As for what folklorists think, modern-day folklorists think this creature is probably just folklore. I guess that shouldn't really be surprising. Some modern misinterpretations of true aquatic species being misidentified with the convenient help of suggestive Native American lore and the popularity of aquatic monster sightings in the early 1800s. Surprisingly, cryptozoologists go a similar route, suggesting that this was likely something more akin to a bull shark, a gar, or a sturgeon than a plesiosaur or whatever else. Additionally, at least in the case of the 1877 events, there were indeed large river fish, gars in particular, known to have been observed in the region around Gadsden, so perhaps that's exactly what this was. Also, it goes without saying, no body of any spectacular river serpent has ever surfaced in the rivers of Alabama, at least not ones that weren't prehistoric bones. Of course, despite these reasonable alternatives, the rivers of the region are well known to foster legends of large creatures. In Georgia, for instance, there's legends of the massive Altamaha, which we'll talk about in another video soon. Also, there's Florida's St. Johns River Monster and Tennessee's Loch Muscle Shoals Monster, monster. In short, to many, these tales of river monsters are all too common in the region, possibly suggesting there's more truth to these legends than many want to admit. I say this without exaggeration. When I read about the story of Huggin Molly on September 11th of 2020, the day I wrote and recorded my first weird folklore video for this channel, it was all over for me. I fell in love with telling these stories, so I could not in any circumstance leave Huggin Molly off this list. The tale of Huggin Molly is an over a century-old legend about a phantom, clad in black, roaming the streets of Abbeville, Alabama. Traditional lore describes her as big around as a bale of cotton and 7 feet tall, and she's always on the lookout for a child. Stories tell that she hungers for these hugs, desiring them, and wherever she goes during the day, it's these hugs that are on her mind. Come nightfall, though, it is her time to shine. See, she'll take to the streets, giddy for the opportunity to see not adults but children out roaming in the night. Then, her tall, cloaked, and veiled self will pursue these children, grab them tightly so they can't escape, and scream into the ears of these captured kids. As such, parents of the region warn their children of Huggin Molly, and that if they're out after dark, they're liable to run into this creature of the night. Apparently, Molly is especially active on nights that are stormy and moonless. Of course she is, that's some proper spooky stuff. Also, don't fret, there's actually a backstory for this popular local cryptid or ghost. One version of this story paints Huggin Molly as a mother who lost her child, and thus she hungers to hug children to fill the hole in her heart and cope with the pain of her loss. Others actually treat Huggin Molly as a sort of ghost, the spirit of a taken woman who is actually looking to keep kids off the street to protect them from the man who took her life. Some even say that Molly is a teacher or a college professor, likely from the old Alabama agricultural school in Abbeville, who was sick of kids running amok at night and began taking to the streets to scare them into returning home to keep the students safe. Other stories even say Huggin Molly is a witch, I kid you not, that hates fat kids, and thus hugs them to test if they're proper chubby, and if they are chubby, she'll scream in their ears. Geez, Molly, I didn't know you were turning Abbeville into your own personal fat camp. Also, here and there, you'll find a few specific tellings of the legend with named individuals. For instance, around the 1920s, there's a story of a delivery boy named Mac Gregory, who was in Abbeville walking home after dusk, and saw a large black figure chasing him. He apparently sprinted inside of his home and locked the door behind him, deciding not to make a delivery this night. Since this encounter, many have said that he had a run-in with the proper Huggin Molly. Also in 2010, a public school teacher leading a cemetery tour in the region claimed, I say this in quotes, to see a ghostly large black woman among the cemetery tombstones who vanished in front of the tour group. So as for what? These serious folks wearing khakis and lab coats that sit at desks and act all serious think of this legend. Well, folklorists generally consider this folklore. I think I've said this twice in this video now. No surprise there. Rather than saying she's 100% real, they say Huggin Molly was essentially a classic southern fict, or a tale sold off as true to scare kids off of what were dangerous nighttime streets. She's essentially a boogeyman passed down orally for generations that has managed to become part of the town's identity, and this legend even reflects historical anxieties, so to speak, of the night, the unlit streets, and the dangers of lurking after dark in the contemporary, segregated towns of the early 20th century in rural Alabama. In summary, the tale is a generational warning. Stay home by dark, or this dreadful woman will get you. Also, trust me, this isn't just some BS lore. It's really pretty pervasive. In 2013, for instance, just outside of Abbeville, the town planted a sign declaring it was the home of Huggin Molly, with a silhouette of the looming woman chasing a child. Also, in downtown Abbeville, there's a 1950s-themed diner and ice cream shop named Huggin Molly's, with menu items named after the legend, and newspaper clippings and comics referencing the legend of Huggin Molly. So in short, what started as a sort of wives' tale to frighten children into obedience, it's sort of become a point of town pride and tourist curiosity that persists in the town to this day. Gosh, Abbeville, I promise one day I'll visit you and maybe I'll get a hug from Molly myself. On November 30th of 1954, in Sylacauga, Alabama, something sort of incredible happened. A woman named Anne Elizabeth Hodges was struck by a meteorite at about 12:46 p.m. A meteorite, weighing about 8.5 pounds, would enter Earth's atmosphere, creating a fireball seen in 3 U.S. states, and causing a loud explosion, breaking into many fragments, one of which would actually pass through the roof of Hodges' home in Oak Grove, bounce off of a large wooden console radio, and then strike Anne Hodges on her left side and wrist while she was napping, of all things. What a way to wake up. This afternoon, during her nap, she would become the first and only person ever to be struck by a meteorite. Funny enough, given the Red Scare was going on, there were fears that this might have been a wrecked Soviet spaceship or satellite. But no, it was just a rock from space. Luckily, Anne miraculously was bruised but hardly damaged. Following this, the meteorite was actually confiscated by local authorities and even given to the U.S. Air Force. And Anne Hodges and her landlord, named Bertie Guy, claimed ownership of the meteorite, but after legal battles, Hodges would get ownership of the meteorite for about $500. She actually at first used the meteorite as a friggin' doorstop. In the aftermath, Hodges sort of became a minor celebrity, probably a bigger one than this guy named T that runs a weird YouTube channel at least. She'd appear on game shows and even get interviews, but would eventually get sick of the limelight and back out of it. Eventually, this meteorite was donated to the Alabama Museum of Natural History, where it remains on display and is referred to as the Hodges Fragment in Anne's honor. Today, in the city of Sylacauga, there's actually a monument to this meteorite that's fittingly, funny enough, made of marble, given Sylacauga itself is actually called the Marble City, given its convenient location atop a vein of creamy marble. If I told you there was a famous leprechaun sighting, so famous, in fact, that it was covered by the actual National Leprechaun Museum in Dublin, Ireland, you'd probably think it happened in Ireland, or maybe in Boston or Savannah or some other place where there's enough Irish ancestry to justify green beer and bad tattoos of Celtic knots. But nope, this legendary leprechaun tale didn't come from the misty hills of County Kerry. It came from Mobile, Alabama. This thing went down in a neighborhood called Crichton in 2006, and it quickly became one of the first true viral YouTube videos. We're talking ancient internet history here, back when uploading a video still required a prayer and a dial-up connection in some cases. The whole saga started on March 14th of 2006, when a local news station aired a segment that would go on to change lives, or at least ruin search results for Alabama Leprechaun forever. The story, a leprechaun, yes, a literal tiny green man, was spotted in a tree on LeCrin Street, near Bayshore Avenue. According to witnesses, this magical little bastard only came out at night, and if you shined a light on him, he'd vanish. Poof, like your paycheck after a Target run. Now, when the first reports came in, people assumed it was a joke, or drugs, or a drug-fueled joke, but then more people showed up, then more, and suddenly there was a full-on crowd gathered under this very normal tree, just staring up, yelling about leprechauns. And to be fair, the tree did have a funny shadow going on. Branches too close together, a little moss here and there, and probably some lingering Mardi Gras regret, but some folks were 100% convinced they saw something magical. There's a moment in the news clip that lives in my head rent-free too. One moment literally says, "It could be a crackhead that got a hold of the wrong stuff, and it told him to get up in that tree and play a leprechaun." And honestly, it's not the worst theory. And then it got weirder. People started bringing out binoculars, video cameras, and other high-tech leprechaun tracking gear, like they were auditioning for Ghost Hunter's Shamrock Edition. One guy, dead serious, came out wearing Kevlar, holding a special leprechaun flute, I say that in quotes, that he claimed, this African-American man claimed, had been passed down to him by his great-great-grandfather who was Irish. This man deserves a statue. Some residents started talking about digging up the base of the tree because they thought there might be gold buried underneath it. Why? Because that's what leprechauns do in cartoons, I guess. Screw permits or logic, it was time for neighborhood treasure hunt. Meanwhile, at the barbershop and in church, people kept asking local news reporter Brian Johnson about the sighting, and this thing kind of snowballed Alabama style. The news ran an artist sketch of the leprechaun that honestly looks like someone tried to draw Yoda while drunk, but hey, it's an iconic drawing now. And to this day, I kid you not, some people really do believe this leprechaun was real. But those individuals that do not believe it's real have theories. One theory is that a man known locally, and I hate to say this, but I swear it's in the records, he's known locally as Midget Sean, again not my words, please don't cancel me. He dressed up in green and climbed the tree and pretended to be a leprechaun, while someone else called the news. If this is true, this is hands down one of the best pieces of performance art I've ever heard of. So anyways, one thing people ask is if this leprechaun is real, why would it be in Mobile? Well, there's a bit of an answer. It turns out the city has a shockingly long and magical history. It was founded in 1702 after all, before Alabama was even a state. And it was also the site of America's first Mardi Gras, which might explain the chaotic, party-friendly energy of this whole saga. Leprechauns do love music and a good party after all. What I'm not so sure of is if leprechauns would enjoy Alabama humidity after coming from Ireland. Anyways, regardless of whether or not this was real, the governor of Alabama at the time officially acknowledged the sighting. I'm not exactly sure what kind of form that requires, maybe a notary public and a pot of gold, but it happened. Anyways, now every year around St. Patrick's Day, this is why you can find cardboard cutouts of the Crichton Leprechaun being sold at a local sign shop in Mobile, Alabama. It's become a thing, a weird, wonderful, slightly cracked thing that only Alabama could pull off. So if you ever find yourself in Mobile in March, I guess look up in the trees. And if you see a little green guy, maybe don't shine the light on him. Let the little man do his thing. In Huntsville, Tennessee, there's one of my absolute favorite museums, period. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center. That being said, while this is a museum dedicated to showcasing our rockets and artifacts of the U.S. space program, there's something uncharacteristic for a museum out front. A grave. And this grave, despite sort of seeming out of place itself, is out of place in another way. Instead of commemorating a great human astronaut of old, it reads, Miss Baker, squirrel monkey, born 1957, died November 29th of 1984. First U.S. animal to fly to space and return alive, May 28th of 1959. That's right, folks, one of our greatest astronauts is buried right here, Miss Baker, and there's a sweet tradition tied to this grave, but first, let me briefly tell you her story and the events that led to this. See, in the early days of the space race, the United States wasn't about to risk strapping a human into a metal canister and yeeting them into orbit without first running a few live test flights. So in the 1940s and 50s, the US Air Force and NASA began launching monkeys, mice, and other creatures into suborbital flights. The idea was fairly simple. If animals could survive the intense G-forces of a launch, the weightlessness of space, and the fiery plunge back to Earth through the atmosphere, then maybe humans could too. But this was more than a glorified carnival ride for primates. Scientists rigged the capsules with sensors and monitors to track the animal's heart rate, brain activity, respiration, and stress levels. In short, in a manner that was kind of sad, but is also kind of cute, these animals were wired up like tiny little astronauts, with helmets, harnesses, and all that jazz. Imagine if an alien saw them up there, they'd probably think, oh my god, this mouse or monkey built a spaceship. Pardon my dumb jokes, but the data was crucial for designing life support systems for humans and predicting how the human body might handle zero gravity and cosmic radiation, something nobody had experienced before, and understandably, the USA didn't want someone to learn the consequences of a launch into space the hard way. The results were admittedly pretty mixed. In 1949, a rhesus monkey named Albert II became the first primate in space aboard a V-2 rocket, reaching 83 miles above Earth. He survived the flight into space, according to the data on board. Oof, but he tragically died on impact because, well, parachutes weren't really reliable yet. He hit the ground like a meteor. Gordo was another. He was a squirrel monkey, and he flew in 1958 and gave scientists excellent data on surviving launch and microgravity. But then NASA lost his capsule in the Atlantic, so I guess technically Gordo made it to space, and I guess he made it back to Earth, But sadly, he did not make it back to bananas and warm green grass. Among these unsung heroes, though, Miss Baker stands out as a genuine, successful astronaut. In 1959, she and her crewmate, a rhesus monkey named Abel, were launched aboard a Jupiter rocket in a mission that reached 300 miles in altitude and 16,000 miles per hour. The pair became the first U.S. animals to survive a spaceflight and return safely. Abel sadly died a few days later during surgery to remove an electrode, but Miss Baker lived on in well-earned fame. She posed for photos, appeared on magazine covers, and even had a quiet retirement in the U.S. Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama, where visitors could come say hello. She lived to the ripe old age of 27, got fan mail, and was even buried with full honors in a marked grave, the grave we just mentioned. For a squirrel monkey, she's about as close to a rock star as their species has ever gotten. In all, these early animal missions laid the groundwork for human spaceflight, helping ensure that when astronauts like Alan Shepard and John Glenn took their own rides, they weren't flying blind. They may not get the sexy accolade of first man on the moon or anything, but hey, they were in every sense the original astronauts, tiny furry pioneers in pressurized boxes. And as I mentioned, Miss Baker is buried right here at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center today, near the building's entrance. And many who visit apparently pay respect to this tiny astronaut by coming and leaving a banana on her headstone to say, hey, thanks for being a good monkey. Now excuse me real quick, I've got to tell my wife to stop cutting onions. So a few years ago, I was in Birmingham around Christmas visiting a friend, and we were hanging out at Back 40 Beer Company, pizza in one hand, pint in the other, watching football and talking trash with the table next to us, as one does. Somewhere between a bad call and a worse opinion, I mentioned, hey, I'm a YouTuber, I cover weird stuff, you got any local legends? One of those guys grinned and went, you ever hear about the underground river that runs under Birmingham all the way to the Gulf of Mexico? Now let me pause here, because I live for that kind of sentence. I mean, you can't just say underground river to the Gulf like it's a normal thing and expect me not to bite. The guy told me he first heard about this at Dread River Distilling Company. Apparently there's a display on the wall that mentions the existence of underground water sources below Birmingham discovered in the late 1800s. Now at first I was skeptical, but here's the thing, there's actually some truth to this water part. See, back in the day when builders started construction projects in early Birmingham, they'd frequently strike water just a few feet below the surface. Basements flooded, wells filled fast, the city was basically a leaky bathtub. One particularly watery spot is the Avondale Business District's 41st Street, formerly known, get this, as Spring Street, because, well, there was a literal spring that flowed out of the hillside and into Avondale Park. I found a quote from a local history source that said, 41st Street is the old Huntsville Road, much used by travelers in the day of the stagecoach. Here at the big spring they stopped, slaked their thirst, and tarried to admire the beauties of the valley and mountain spread out before them. Campers were frequent, and it is said they were loath to leave once they had tasted the pure, sparkling waters of the spring and viewed the scenic beauty of the surrounding area. I mean, heck, that sounds downright romantic, like a glamping brochure, really. Even today, you can still see evidence of the spring on the hillside. Avondale Brewing also even honors it with their own Spring Street Saison. So yeah, that's real, but then the story takes a sharp turn into full-on Scooby-Doo territory. Here enters Joseph Mulhattan, self-proclaimed scientist, cave expert, and explorer. In 1884, the Birmingham Iron Age newspaper published a wild story written by Mulhattan titled Underneath Us. In it, he claimed, along with a whole group of distinguished-sounding local men, Dr. Joseph R. Smith, W.S. Brown, W.M. Hood, T.J. Bourne, W.M. Burney, G.O.C. Kelly, J.B. Early, and others, they discovered a mysterious inlet in the ground from which they heard rushing water. Naturally, they decided to lower a boat into it, because that's what you do when you hear weird noises, I guess, coming from a mysterious hole in the ground. You throw a boat in and see what happens. What followed was allegedly a 15-mile journey through an underground cavern large enough to hold the boat. They encountered a temporary blockage, which they of course thought they could clear with a little elbow grease. and guessed this river flowed all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Mulhattan, channeling his inner Jules Verne, theorized that the river was carved by glacial icebergs during the Ice Age, and this is where it truly gets bananas, that it was used by an ancient race of people for underground travel between Birmingham and the Gulf of Mexico. And it didn't stop there. They found bones of a sea monster, preserved mummies, and my personal favorite, a wrecked ship that was apparently attached to the bones of a sea monster. That's right, forget mermaids or lost cities. This man gave us a B-movie script involving prehistoric sea beasts doing maritime labor underneath Alabama. If true, this would be one of the greatest geological and archaeological discoveries in the Western Hemisphere. But was it true? Well, kind of, sort of, not really. You can find old ads from the late 1800s offering mystic underground river excursions, which sounds like either a Victorian theme park ride or a euphemism for a bad experience on a dating app, but there's no evidence that anyone actually ever took a trip down this alleged subterranean highway. And from what I can tell, the only consistent subterranean flowing water source nearby is the gentle little cave stream in Avondale Park. Which brings us back to the man behind this madness, Joseph Mulhattan. Despite the professor title he apparently gave himself, in actuality he was a Pennsylvania-born traveling salesman who eventually settled in Kentucky. And when he wasn't selling stuff, he was selling stories, straight-up tales peddled to tabloid newspapers across the South. For instance, he was actually the one that retold the Williamson disappearance in Selma in Gallatin, Tennessee, selling that to a newspaper in Gallatin. He also said he found a lost pyramid full of gold in Kentucky, and perhaps most hilariously, he sold a story to a Tennessee newspaper claiming a little girl had floated away in a windstorm because she was carrying too many balloons. Tragic, right? That's right, he invented the original Up, but with more tragedy and fewer talking dogs. So, no, Joseph wasn't a scientist at all. He was more like a 19th century version of Florida Man with access to a printing press. Which means this underground river to the Gulf story, yeah, I hate to say it, it's total malarkey. Entertaining malarkey, though. Beautifully absurd, sea monster hauling a boat kind of malarkey, but malarkey all the same. Still, there are real springs under Birmingham, and that's what makes this so fun. The way real bits of geology can mix in with a fever dream of mythology. It's like adding a shot of truth to your Smoky Mountain moonshine. So I guess next time you're in Birmingham, raise a glass to the city's subterranean mysteries. Just don't go digging for mummies or trying to hitch a ride to the Gulf. You'll probably just hit a sewer line, or worse, you might find Joseph Mulhattan's ghost pitching a screenplay. Okay, let's say you're walking through the woods of Alabama, just generally in northern Alabama, and suddenly, something ain't right. You smell something foul, and then you hear loud, thudding footsteps, and suddenly a large, shaggy, white-furred humanoid creature walks out of the woods that's extremely tall, probably 10 feet in height, with a bulky but clearly agile build and red glowing eyes. If you encounter this, you may very well have encountered the so-called White Thang, Alabama's most well-known cryptid and, according to some, its own variety of Bigfoot. Thang, by the way, is a nod to the way that Southerners with a twang, unlike me, sometimes say the word thing. The Thang, though, is not always described as Bigfoot-like. I would actually contend it's not really a Bigfoot at all. See, in most descriptions, it's only Bigfoot-esque until this thing takes to all fours and starts behaving in a manner that's almost cat-like. For instance, there's a White Thang story starring a man named George Morris, who would decide to take a nap at a graveyard, I suppose outside of the Enon Baptist Church in South Vinemont, Alabama, and he awoke not to Bigfoot, but to a large and hairy white creature that reminded him more of some variety of lion than ape. Interestingly, this creature was just kind of staring at him. It didn't try to do anything bad. Also, I find this interesting because some describe this creature's sound as being some sort of scream, like a woman's scream, and scientists have described sound bites of this noise to resemble those of a panther screaming. There's also a notable 1940s sighting of the White Thang that describes it as bounding across a field with incredible speed and fur that was glowing in the moonlight. Frankly, having had the pleasure and terror of observing a mountain lion hunt in Colorado one time, I would also describe that creature as bounding with incredible speed. So maybe that too was some sort of big cat. Heck, on Reddit, and yes, I hate citing Reddit, but people post personal accounts there a lot. Someone actually recounted back in the early 2000s that near Guntersville State Park, south of Huntsville, while driving home in the dark, this individual drove by what they interpreted to be an albino tiger eating roadkill on the side of the road, and the poster's wife also confirmed she thought she saw this too. Stories of this creature actually go pretty far back, to at least the 1930s, to tales that tell of this creature emerging from Big Nats Creek in Cortland, Alabama, where in the midst of the Great Depression, locals began to catch a whiff of and sight large hairy creatures with glowing red eyes roaming the region. To this day, the creature remains frequently seen around Cortland, where it is seen especially often around water sources. Admittedly, they actually call this creature the Slough Thing instead of the White Thing, but my impression is that these two are pretty much the exact same. As for where you can most often see this creature, well, if you can't tell, generally, the more rural communities within a few tens of miles of Huntsville seem like fair game. But historically speaking, state parks, particularly those with many bodies of water, lakes, rivers, and creeks, are your best bet. So in short, I think the White Thing is actually intriguing. It sort of hits this trifecta for me of being A, frequently seen, B, consistent in the region it's seen in, and C, possibly being attributable to a creature we know exists, a large cat of sorts. Personally, as someone who's read about 100, if not thousands, of sightings of large cats in the southeastern USA that various Fish and Wildlife Services claim don't exist, I'm actually inclined to believe that there may very well be a small population of big cats in the southern US that remains pretty elusive. So who's to say that this same population doesn't also linger in the hills of northern Alabama? And who's to say this group of cats wasn't so isolated that it got larger, and possibly that the recessive white-haired gene was predominant in this population? Personally, I think it's a fascinating prospect, and frankly, basically none of the descriptions, except for the one in Cortland, suggest anything but some variety of cat to me. But hey, maybe I'm getting this wrong. Anyways, let me know. Have you seen the White Thing? Is it a cat? Is it Bigfoot? Is it something totally new to this world? Let me know what you think down below. But personally, if there was going to be a cryptid that was elusive, I would think it would be a cat. I don't know, for me it just makes a lot of sense. The story of Bangor Cave is a banger of a story. See what I did there? And it lives alongside many Prohibition-era tales that tell of ingenuity and the indomitable human spirit that not only refuses to give up in the face of adversity, but also refuses to stop having fun in the face of what I would consider to be an oppressive government. The stories really kind of go to show that you can make things illegal all you want, but you can never tell an American that they can't have their booze. Now, the story of this cave begins well before the Prohibition era, when in the late 19th century, geologist Walter B. Jones discovered this cave and propelled it to the status of local attraction. This cave, which would become of the Blount Springs Resort area, would be a popular park and picnic site because of this, around the time of the late 1800s and early 1900s. Here, tourists would roam the cave by candlelight and torchlight, and concerts were even held in its main chamber. Its popularity was helped, too, by the fact that the Louisville and Nashville Railroad terminated at the nearby Bangor Depot, which essentially brought tourists all but to the entrance of this cave. Here, the main chamber, which was about 350 feet long by 57 feet wide and 20 feet in height, was the main attraction, and the one that held concerts, and it would branch out into 7 further chambers, ending about 1,000 feet from the main entrance. As I suggested, though, in the 1930s, this cave would transition from geological wonder to a bit of local nightlife. While in 1937, the Prohibition era was well and over at a national level, in Alabama, the story was a bit different. Alabama not only kept alcohol sales illegal until 1937 at a state level, but even after this, dry counties were pretty common, and Blount County, in which this nightclub would be founded, was one of them, adding a layer of, let's say, complexity to this business venture. Regardless, a landowner, J. Breck Musgrove, and some local investors in the summer of 1937 would spend around $70,000, turning this cave into a speakeasy. They'd carve some of the rocks at the interior into a bar and bandstand, and they'd even level the main chamber floor with concrete, covering it with linoleum tiles. They'd even place down carpet in one of the chambers as a lounge for women, and paint the ceiling of the main chamber to resemble the night sky. In other chambers, often behind iron doors and back rooms, they would store slot machines, roulette wheels, craps tables, and card games, essentially hiding an illegal casino within, another very illegal feature of this attraction. As such, upon opening in early summer of 1937, the entertainment here was lavish for the times. There were frequent orchestras that played, led by band lead Billy Yates. There were vaudeville acts. Diners were served for $1.10, and if you were feeling fancy, you could bring your own liquor or purchase martinis for 35 cents. Also, like a proper illegal operation, it said that stacks of $1,000 bills were kept behind the bar. They even added a railroad stop so that for an extra 10 cents, guests could be dropped off at Bangor Cave. This cave, in short, offered a taste of high society and big city nightlife in relatively rural Alabama. As for the visitors here, you sadly wouldn't see any of the most famous celebrities of the era. Al Capone, for instance, was already locked up at this point, but it was well known that everyone from local elites to gamblers and gangsters seeking refuge were frequent visitors of this place. Contemporary press even notes that the cave's patrons were often high rollers and crooks who reveled in its secrecy. My understanding is that criminals were even sometimes employed here at what was billed as America's only underground nightclub. Luckily for the nightclub, though, this place was more locally than nationally notorious, briefly at least keeping it off the map of law enforcement. It wasn't long, though, until the governor of Alabama, Governor Bibb Graves, would place this on a statewide list of notorious dives that he wanted closed down. On August 1st of 1937, it said that the Blount County Sheriff would lead the first raid on this place. The raid was described as hitting it with a bang that reverberated across the entire state. Our new sheriff raided Bangor County, made a haul not on the gambling tables, but in arrests and drinks that make men wilder. Over the next 2 years, subsequent raids would take place and authorities would repeatedly padlock the entrance and seize any evidence of gambling they could. Each time, the club would briefly reopen, but by January of 1939, under relentless pressure, the club would close permanently. Local newspapers largely agreed with this choice, with one journalist referring to it as a den of vice unequaled in Alabama. After the nightclub closed down, this cave, Bangor Cave, slipped back into obscurity. Sometimes spelunkers and general adventurers would visit the abandoned site, but the cave was heavily vandalized, and today you can see graffiti and trash in the chambers. That being said, today the bar and bandstand are still evident inside, but most other signs of the nightclub have disappeared. The cave, nowadays, is held privately, and it's not open to the public. No tours are allowed here without the owner's permission. I did, luckily, come across some plans to restore it to its natural beauty, but as of now, there's no formal plan in place, so sadly, I gotta tell you gotta stay out of this one, otherwise you're trespassing. Regardless, local historians preserve the story of this cave, and there are a few exhibits you can find around that showcase what it was in its heyday as a club. Personally, I love oddities like this, and this nightclub, at least to me, seems like it was a fun and colorful episode in Alabama history. The story of the Gadsden Witch goes by a few names. Sometimes they call her the Gadsden Witch of the Woods, other times the Witch of Hinds Road. But either way you slice it, it's a pervasive local legend, and it was also another legend in my first video covering the urban legends of the USA, so it's my sworn duty to reprise it and give it even more detail. This story tells of a woman named Torbid, or Torbit, who lives off of Hinds Road, and who lived in the woods of this road near a pond, and at one point sold her soul to the devil in exchange for everlasting life and for her beauty to remain forever. As such, to sustain her evil soul, she would steal the local youth in the mid-1900s, taking them back to the pond near her home and sacrificing them inside of it to the devil himself. Of course, you can't just do evil forever and get away with it. Eventually, it said, sometime between 1938 and 1940, some locals would actually discover the pond by Torbid's shack dyed red with blood, and remains were floating around in it. They would also find a nearby cave, a cave that you can still explore in the area to this day, and it would be filled with remains and smelled foul, and deeper inside of it, they found a woman, unclothed, who they would confirm was the witch. Of course, this group would run into town and sound the alarms, and a mob would descend upon her home later this evening, locking her inside of the shack in the woods that she dwelled in and lighting the house aflame. It's said that at first the mob would hear screams, and then her shack would burn to the ground, and upon inspecting the ashes, they would find her charred remains. But when this mob headed back into Gadsden, they'd start to hear laughing, and in the months and years that followed, this laughing would be frequently heard along Hinds Road, and sometimes locals would see an unclothed and beautiful woman standing beside what could only be described as a hellhound standing near it. Some even claim they'd stop to talk to this woman, and without fail, the story would devolve into this woman claiming she sold her soul to the devil, sometimes beginning to scream at visitors when the conversation reached this point. So now I ask, is there truth to this tale? Well, frankly, we should know this by now. There's always truth to a good folk story, and wouldn't you have it, some locals actually report that this woman, named Miss Humphrey or possibly Miss Torbett, lived alone in a shack by a pond off of Hinds Road with her dog, and possibly a pet peacock. So according to these accounts, yes, Torbett was real after all. She wasn't a witch though. These accounts essentially say she was just a nice old woman, and her house wasn't burnt by a mob. Rather, it did burn down, but it burnt down by accident one day while she was cooking. There was also no massacre of local youth. There was no hellhound. It was just an old widow and her dog that lived in the woods outside of town. Now, as for the precise location of this supposed witch's shack, it's said to be along Hinds Road, as you might expect, in eastern Gadsden, and some say it's near Nakalula Falls and the old Dwight Mill Village. The road itself is quiet and surrounded by relatively dense woods, and from what I can tell, not many folks, if anyone, actually live on this road. Historically speaking, the nearby Dwight Mill Village was built in 1894 by the Dwight Mill Manufacturing Company for cotton mill workers, and that's how much of this area was originally populated. Some stories even suggest that her husband was one of these mill workers. Now, despite the fact that this area is, in actuality, probably not that notorious, the Witch of Hinds Road is a bona fide urban legend, and sometimes a ghost story that you'll quickly run across if you're looking for lore in Alabama, and you'd be hard-pressed not to run across this legend covered by various podcasts and ghost hunting shows on the internet. Heck, if you're visiting Hinds Road, you might even run into some local thrill seekers, maybe someone like me. Anyways, I love this one. When I think folklore, I think of stories like these, and it's always a treat to hear a good story about a witch with some solid explanation for how it came to be. In the sleepy Alabama pines near the Carlton community, there's a place where the dead don't just rest in peace, they stare back at you with concrete faces and oddly familiar expressions. Welcome to Mount Nebo Baptist Church Cemetery, one of the only graveyards in America where the tombstones look back at you in surprise like they've maybe just seen you naked or something. And this oddity, that is frankly sort of a miraculous piece of art, is all thanks to one man, Isaac Ike Nettles Sr., a local genius, inventor, artist, Tuskegee man, and part-time sorcerer of cement. Born in 1885, Ike wasn't your average Clark County farmer. While his neighbors were wrestling mules and cursing the weather, Ike was building machines that he hoped would revolutionize the timber industry, crafting a patented pedal car for children, and, oh yes, making mud molds of living people's faces to slap onto their future tombstones, something macabre that was for memory's sake. The process for doing this was straight out of a mad scientist's scrapbook. Ike would invite you over, while you were still very much alive, mind you, and have you press your face into a box of damp sand. From that, he'd create a plaster cast, and eventually a concrete mask, which he'd carefully mount to your gravestone once you kicked the bucket. It was personal, it was haunting, and it was just a little bit creepy and sort of sweet in equal measure. His first mask was for his beloved mother, Selena, who passed away in 1933. But Ike didn't stop with a simple face for Mama. No, he built her a half-body sculpture complete with hair, possibly her own, a wire skeleton, and the kind of craftsmanship that says, I love you, but also I may be a little bit unhinged. Then came the triple whammy, a gravestone for his wife, Korean Nettles, who also died in 1933. That's a pretty sad coincidence, featuring not one, not two, but three faces, also those of their daughters, Pauline, Maria, and Clara, who weren't even dead yet. That's right, the girls were very much alive, which makes this the only tombstone in Alabama to come pre-installed with faces of the living as far as I can tell. It's like if your mom put your kindergarten photo on her headstone and said, I'll just go ahead and get the whole thing ready. Another of Ike's creations was for Angel Izella Dolly Nettles, his aunt, whose nickname made her sound like a juke joint singer, but whose grave got the signature Ike treatment, mask and name. Only one mask was commissioned by someone outside of the family, Manuel Burrell, who died in 1946. Manuel took one look at Ike's eerie masterpieces and said, yes sir, I want one too, which must have made for some awkward small talk in the Carlton General Store. Say Ike, when you got a minute, could you make a death mask of my face? No rush, just before the pneumonia sets in later. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Some folks thought Ike was a bit eccentric. He was a recluse, and he didn't pass on his methods to anyone else. His death mask secrets went with him to the grave, which ironically is marked by the most boring headstone in the whole place. His grave doesn't have any face. There's no flare, it's just a slab. The man who made tombs into art decided to blow out with a whisper instead of a scream. Folklorists now believe these death masks are relatively unique in the Southeast, maybe even in the whole country. People have traveled from all over to see the frozen faces of Mount Nebo, as they're called, though a few tourists have accidentally driven into cow pastures because the street signs went missing. Some say the ghosts of Mount Nebo took them down for privacy. Unfortunately, time and a few bored vandals haven't been kind to Ike's work. The weather chips away at the masks, and preservationists are stuck in a pickle. Fixing them would sort of taint their historic folk art value. As Carrie Reed of the Clark County Historical Museum put it, she told us to document, referring to a folk art expert they talked to. In other words, take a bunch of photos before some drunk teenagers with rocks decide to high-five history. Still though, to this day, some of the faces remain, staring, remembering, and enduring. So the next time you find yourself near Carlton, Alabama, swing by Mount Nebo, stand in front of a grave, and look that face in the eye, and remember the genius who made it possible. And if you feel the need to press your face into a box of sand afterwards, well, you might just be catching the Ike Nettles spirit. Also, this goes without saying, if you damage one of these headstones, you are distinctly uncool and I don't like you. Preserve these strange treasures, people. Holy cow, we really came full circle here, didn't we? On September 11th of 2020, I remember recording my very first Alabama folklore video in my room in South Boston, and here I am reprising it, and hopefully making it a little bit better. It's a cool feeling to return here and see these stories again. Dare I say, I sort of missed them. Now, regardless, if you liked these stories, I would love it if you could support this channel with a like, a subscription, and a comment. It will never cost you a single dime, and it's an easy way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Otherwise, as for what's next, Franklin, Tennessee, we are going to pay your haunted places a visit. And then Georgia, we're coming for you. And then I had some people vote on it. It looks like Savannah, Georgia is getting a Dark Places video. I'm trying to actually move down that way to be closer to family if I can find a job, so I might as well get to know the spooky stuff in the area a little bit better. Also, this goes without saying, but whether you just saw a white tiger on the side of the road in rural Alabama, or if you were spelunking in a cave and came across a party deep inside of it, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.